Hello everybody, and welcome to the YouTube channel of Skip Allen. This video will be in response to a question that was on Painter Factory. And the question was how to increase the brush density of the watercolor brush so that every time a brush stroke goes over another stroke, it multiplies. And the questioner gave us a screenshot from Manga Studio 5 showing us of what he's expecting the brush stroke to do. And that's real helpful. Well, let's switch over to Painter. But let me talk a little bit more about asking questions. The questioner did a really good job of asking the question, but he left out a couple of very important points. If you tell us, obviously he must have used a watercolor brush and he found the brush to be lacking. It didn't do what he expected. Well, if you tell us what brush that is, then we can go directly to the point, and look at that brush and see if there's something about it that causes it not to do as you expect, or maybe there's something the questioner is doing wrong with the brush, or maybe it's a bug. I don't know, but if we can know what the brush is, then we're more likely able to pinpoint an answer for you. Now, watercolor is kind of complex, too, because there's more than one category, and each category is different. If I come up to the brush selector and I click on the down arrow to open up the brush library panel, you can see that I have a watercolor category here at the bottom. If I come up a little bit, I have another watercolor category called Real Watercolor. And if I come up even further, I have a watercolor category called Digital Watercolor. And each one of those is a little bit different. And so what makes them different? Well, if we look at the general brush control panel, and that you can find under Window, Brush Control Panels, General. If I look at that, if I want to make a digital watercolor brush, it's probably the easiest because there's only one thing I really have to look at, and I have to look at the method. And I come down here and I click on Digital Wet. Now, that brush, this bleach runny watercolor brush, is no longer a watercolor brush, it's a digital wet watercolor brush. So if I have my method as digital wet, it will always be a digital watercolor brush, no exceptions. As long as it's active. If I have some other kind of dab type, I can use the first 5 dabs: circular, single pixel, static bristle, captured, and eraser, or the very last dab, computed circle, with digital wet method to get a digital watercolor brush. Okay, so let's take this back to its default. Now, another method is wet, and the watercolor category can use wet, but the real watercolor category always uses wet. And if I drop down the menu, you will see that wet is what I've selected, and then we come down to subcategory, and we have real wet buildup, real wet cover, real wet replace, real dry buildup, and real dry cover. Those are hard to say. Those 5 subcategories determine that the brush will be a real watercolor brush. So if I change this bleach runny to real wet cover, it is now a real watercolor brush, not a watercolor brush. Okay, so let's go back to where it was. If I want it to be a watercolor brush, it's going to have the method wet, and it will be one of the first 3 subcategories: grainy wet buildup, wet remove density. Okay? Now, watercolor brushes also have another way beside wet. You can click on the dab type and come down to watercolor camel hair, watercolor flat, watercolor palette knife, watercolor bristle spray, watercolor airbrush, and that will give you a watercolor brush as well. Okay, so let's make sure we're on our default. And let's start seeing what it is that makes this brush have an overlap or not. Okay, so the brush is at the default setting, except that I've made it larger. We've got a color that's kind of in the middle of the saturation value triangle. and I'm going to paint real quickly several little strokes like that. Now you'll see that I'm not getting that overlap that we're expecting. And part of the reason that we don't get an overlap is because the brush diffuses and we have set delay diffusion. If you're working with a watercolor brush, then the water panel is the brush control panel that will affect how the watercolor brush acts. And so we've set up delayed diffusion by having an X there. And what that means is I want to let that delayed diffusion finish before I try the next stroke. Now, this is not always the case, but it is the case in this particular brush, the way it is set up. I let it diffuse, and then I come back through, and I'll get my little crossover. Now I have to let it delay a bit more, and I'll come back through, and I'll get that overlay that he was talking about. Okay, so that shows you that we're getting it, but we have to wait. Now, some questions can be answered so simply. Look up here at the dab type that we're using with this brush. It's this pointed profile. What that means is right at the point we have the strongest amount of color, and it drops off as you go out to the side. So that's why the brush looks kind of fuzzy on the edges and dark in the center. What happens if I just change the dab profile to this single pixel edge or 1 pixel edge? Well, now watch. Do that. Let it diffuse a minute, although it's not all that necessary now. And look at there. I've got a real obvious change there. Now, the diffusion is making some difference here. But that change of the brush made a huge difference in the way the brush paints. Okay, so what else would make a difference with this? Well, if I drop the wetness down, because this brush is really wet, it's diffusing a lot, I'm going to drop the pickup down to about 79 or so, 80. And I'll bring up the dry rate to about 80 and the evaporation threshold to about 80. All of those, the bottom two, dry rate and evaporation threshold, have to do with the paint drying up quickly. And the diffuse amount has to do with how much it diffuses. I want to drop that down to about 20%. And the cap factor talks about how the edge of the brush goes, the edge of the water of the brush kind of filters out into the paper. I don't want any of that. But I'm going to increase the grain soak in, and that lets it soak into the paper, keeps it from kind of running too much. I want to drop the wind force to 0 because I don't want it to move like it was doing before. And then the most important thing of all, I'm going to change the grainy wet abrasive from abrasive to buildup. Now that's a big clue, because if you're using buildup, you're going to get a buildup like watercolor. So now watch. Whoops, that's real dark. The opacity set up for pressure, so let me do a lighter pressure. And then come back through, and then come back through, come back through, and you've got your overlap like what you were doing before. Now, this one's not as bubbly as the one that you saw on the video that was provided by somebody where, as the manga studio looks. But somebody provided a video that a person was working with Painter 6 watercolors. And we got sidetracked to digital watercolors with that. But the guy was actually using Painter 6 watercolors, not a digital watercolor. And I suspect he was using simple water. And if we look at simple water, this is what it looks like. See, that's very similar to what that guy was doing on the video. I'm just guessing there. It could be any one of these, but simple water has grainy wet buildup. Now, you can get these Painter 6 watercolor brushes if you want. They're still available. They're in the extras, in Painter 12 extras. So if you got the extras from Painter 12, you can get the Painter 6 watercolor brushes. Now, let me go back to our standard brush that we were working with. And it has now, because I went out of the same library, or went to a different library, it's gone back to its setup. But what I want to do is I want to bring it back down to where we were, about where we were before. Doesn't have to be perfect here. Take this off and go to grainy wet buildup and show you the difference of what happens between grainy wet buildup and grainy wet abrasive. Let's go back to the grainy wet abrasive. Now, if I make a circle like this and give it a second to diffuse, and I come back and do that again, the brush is going to get, the paint is going to get darker each time that I do it. And it gets pretty dark. Matter of fact, it's getting a lot darker than I thought it was going to get. Let me see if I click this. Yeah, it's not nearly as dark as what I thought, but let's put it back up to here in the middle. Let's put it a little lighter. That'll make it not do quite as much. So we're going to do this again and wait and do it again. It gets darker, and wait and do it again, and it gets darker. And we can keep going, and it's going to get darker and darker each time we go, but we're never going to build up to black. We'll never get there. We'll get darker, as we can see by testing, but we'll never get to black. Now bring that color back up here and change this to grainy wet buildup, and do that multiple times. And you'll see that we're now building up to black. Okay? Now, if you take this to the 1 pixel edge, like I should have done to begin with, it should be even more obvious. Oops, don't want to do that. I want to go back to the red. Okay. All right. So now build up, build up, build up, build up, build up. You see, it's getting darker, but it's taking quite a while. And we're at a point of no return now. I'm not getting any darker as I paint. So that's about as dark as I'm going to get. And again, with grainy wet buildup. Oops, I'm in a dark one again. Let's go back up here to the regular. Look at that, how quickly I can build to black. I usually don't use grainy wet buildup very much because of the fact that it will build up so quickly to black. See, just like that. And you have to be really careful with it. Usually what you've got to do if you're going to use grainy wet buildup is reduce your opacity quite a bit. But the point of this long video now is that, yes, you can get the overlaps like you were talking about with multiply. And your biggest key is to use the buildups. And also you want to get rid of some of the diffusing stuff that's happening and look at your dabs. Look at what your dabs actually do. This one will work pretty well as well. As you go with it, see those nice crossings there. Actually, I've used that dab a lot. Dab profile. Okay, I think I've answered the question. It's kind of hard to know when you're talking about a lot of different things, but it'll give you an idea of where to go from here. All righty, take care. Bye-bye.